2014, China started carrying out its plan to attack 5 countries at once. It started building islands, military islands, right here in the South China Sea, inside the borders of other countries. These fake islands had ports, air bases, and anti-aircraft guns, all ready in case of a war. In just 2 years, China has made not 1, not 2, but 7 of these islands in other countries' borders without their permission. This is one of the reasons why US Army experts believe that these islands, right here in the South China Sea, have the highest chance of instigating World War III. And it all starts with the CCP and their unwillingness to respect other countries' borders. So, in this video, let's go over why the South China Sea is so important to the world and why China is willing to start World War III just to control these parts of the sea. I am once again asking you guys to like the video. My recent videos have been getting restricted heavily in the algorithm, and considering this topic is war-related, I doubt YouTube will show me any mercy. So please, consider hitting the like button below. It really helps me out a lot.
The South China Sea,
the hotly contested body of water.
China has conflicting territorial relations with
the 9-dash line.
The islands of the South China Sea delimits are China's inherent territory.
Chinese vessels are fanning out across
borders of these South China Sea countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia.
Japanese media has also reported that Chinese Coast Guard ships entered the country's territorial waters for a second day in a row.
So before we get into why China is willing to fight so many countries over the South China Sea, first, let's go over what makes this area so important. The South China Sea is a marginal sea in the Pacific Ocean, bounded by South China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. This region is believed to have around 28 billion barrels of oil reserves, 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and holds 1/3 of the entire world's marine biodiversity, thereby making it a very important area for the ecosystem, even if fish stocks in the area are rapidly depleting. If all these weren't reason enough, the South China Sea is a very important trade route. As of 2019, around $3.37 trillion worth of global trade passes through this region annually. The main route to and from Pacific and Indian Ocean ports is through the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. Generally, oil and minerals move north, and food and manufactured goods move south. As I've covered in my previous videos, China is heavily dependent on oil imports to fuel its economy and its industries. Roughly 50% of Chinese oil imports come from the Middle East, and that oil sails through the South China Sea. And as you guys have already heard the last 1,000 times I've said it, China is the world's manufacturing hub, and its economic growth is fueled by selling those manufactured goods to the rest of the world. A big part of China's exports flow through the South China Sea into the rest of the world. So, I'm sure you guys can see that the South China Sea is very important to China. But does that mean that it belongs to China? Yeah, I'm not quite sure. So, let's look at China's supposed claim to this area in just a sec, but first let's go over the international law that defines who controls what part of the ocean. According to the Law of the Sea that was signed in a UN convention in 1982, each country's sovereign territorial waters extends to a maximum of 12 nautical miles, about 22 kilometers beyond its coast. But foreign vessels are granted the right of innocent passage through the zone. Beyond its territorial waters, every coastal country may establish an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, about 370 kilometers from shore. Now, remember this, as this will become really important later on in the video. Within the EEZ, the coastal state has the right to exploit and regulate fisheries, construct artificial islands and installations, and use the zone for other economic purposes. Now, every country recognizes this law, including China, and this is actually how every country has claimed they're part of the South China Sea. 200 nautical miles from their coast. Every country but China. There are some overlaps in Vietnamese, Malaysian, Brunei's, and Filipino claims, but no one is talking much about that because, well, all of these countries are united together against China's claim. Let's address something that's been on my mind before we move forward. After watching my videos or other YouTubers' videos, I'm sure some of you guys have thought about starting your own channel. One of the biggest hurdles people face when starting a YouTube channel is that they are not comfortable showing their face in videos. Not everyone wants to give up their privacy and be in the public eye all the time. That's one of the big reasons why our videos are made in a documentary style. The craziest part is, people still love the videos, as you can see from the fact that we recently crossed 1 million subscribers. In fact, there are millions of faceless YouTube channels making content and earning ad revenue. In just the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, right now is the perfect time. That's why we've launched a completely free 7-day email crash course on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you're interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand. You see, when it comes to this part of the sea, China doesn't want to follow the law of the sea. No. In fact, China wants to follow this made-up 9-dash line to exert its claim. This 9-dash line covers almost 90% of the South China Sea, and the CCP claims that it's all part of China. Now you may ask, what is the reasoning behind this 9-dash line, since there are no laws or really anything that mentions this? Well, according to the CCP's reasoning, a Chinese explorer discovered the South China Sea, so therefore, it belongs to China. I guess by that same reasoning, China belongs to Italy because Marco Polo, quote-unquote, discovered China. It's time for the CCP to pack it up and hand over the reins to the Italians. All right, jokes aside, that really is the reasoning the CCP has used to claim pretty much the whole South China Sea, and it has led to some very confrontational situations with other countries.
China.
Swarming and threatening
Foreign military aircraft. I'm warning you again.
China's Communist Party is building on
Previously unoccupied beaches
in the South China Sea.
more than 200 Chinese vessels
anchored at Whitsun Reef
for the disputed South China Sea.
These islands
indicates China's claims of sovereignty of fishing, navigation, and exploitation.
To assert their claim, several countries in the conflict officially renamed the region that they claimed. In September of 2012, the Philippine president signed an administrative order mandating that all government agencies use the name West Philippine Sea to refer to the parts of the South China Sea within the Philippines. Similarly, in 2017, Indonesia renamed northern reaches of its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea, in an attempt to assert its sovereignty. All while this is happening, the CCP starts building its own islands in the South China Sea. And not just any islands, military islands. They were home to a few military personnel, an airstrip, and a missile system. Based on international law, these islands were within the Philippines' border. So the Philippines decided to take China to UN court. In 2016, a ruling from The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, claiming China had indeed encroached on their land, a ruling that the CCP chose to ignore and has not put into effect yet. To make matters worse, the CCP declared the airspace above the disputed land to be a defensive air identification zone, and issued a notice that aircrafts flying through it would need Chinese permission. This move, while they claim will only be enforced in defense, has further strained relations between these two countries. On top of this, there was a second part of this ruling that was just as important to the whole conflict. You guys remember earlier how I said that according to the law of the sea, 200 nautical miles from the coast is each country's exclusive economic zone? Well, so there's this group of islands in the middle of the South China Sea called the Spratly Islands that all the countries are trying to claim. The main reason being that if you establish a claim on the islands, you can extend your EEZ and control more of the South China Sea. But according to a 2016 ruling, the Spratly Islands were ruled a rock, so they don't extend any country's EEZ. This kinda killed the importance of the islands, but that doesn't mean that the conflict calmed down. China has been using something called the cabbage strategy, or the salami slicing strategy, to choke out supplies to foreign islands. To accomplish this, China will surround a foreign-controlled island with its ships and destroyers to deny access to rival nations, and then try to subsequently claim the islands. Now, of course, the United States has a lot of allies in this conflict, and we have the strongest navy in the world. One important part that the US Navy plays is maintaining peace at sea so world trade can continue without interruption. So, since China was being so aggressive in the South China Sea, the US Navy has increased its presence there to keep peace. And that's where this clip comes from.
U.S. military aircraft, Papa 8 Alpha. This is Chinese Yunsh Reef. China has sovereignty of the national islands, including Yunsh Reef and its adjacent waters. Leave immediately and keep far off so as to avoid any misunderstanding.
Routine occurrence for us on these flights. It happens throughout the flight where they come over and then we just go back with our standard response, and it really has no effect on any operations or anything we do.
Now, that plane is from the US Navy, but here's a random fun fact for the video. The US Air Force has the most military aircrafts in the world. But right behind, in second place, is the US Navy, with the second most military aircrafts. Not really something you would expect. Back to the video. The US presence in the South China Sea is important because Beijing's claim in the South China Sea, especially to historic rights throughout the so-called Nine-Dash Line, threaten the centuries-old US commitment to freedom of the seas. That commitment helped underwrite American prosperity and security. Today, it stabilizes international commerce, mitigates naval tensions, and guarantees equitable access to resources. If China is able to undermine the UN's law of the sea, what's to say that it will follow other laws? And what's to say that other countries won't do the same if China is able to claim territory while breaking the law? This is why US-China tensions are also rising with the CCP's actions in the South China Sea. And even though things were more calm during COVID, China's actions are again picking up steam in the South China Sea, and this time, China is breaking their own promises. Let me explain. In 2011, China, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam agreed on a set of preliminary guidelines on the implementation of the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, which would help resolve disputes. Following the spirit of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, China and ASEAN countries actively advanced the consultations on the Code of Conduct, or COC, in the South China Sea, with the forecast that the COC will be completed by 2021. As you can already tell, the timeline for resolution, it's not really panned out. But that COC has helped maintain some peace in the South China Sea. One important rule in this COC was that no country is allowed to build on unoccupied reefs. But according to a recent Bloomberg report that came out last December, it seems like China has decided to stop following the COC. Fishing fleets that operate as de facto maritime militias under the control of authorities in Beijing have carried out construction activities at 4 unoccupied features. A report said new land formations have appeared above water over the past year at El Dad Reef in the northern Spratlys, with images showing large holes, debris piles, and excavator tracks at a site that used to only be partially exposed at high tide. This kind of action could mean a lot of things on what the CCP is planning for the future, and none of those possibilities are good for world peace. China's actions have prompted other nations in the region to step up their defense spending. Now, I don't want to speculate on what the CCP is planning, but if there's any concrete news on this topic, I will be making another video. So be sure to hit that subscribe button. This is China's Jiangling River, running dry because of record heat and drought that the country is facing. Just to show the true effect of this video, here's how the river looked before the drought. Recently, China's property woes, bank crisis, and foreign policy towards Taiwan have become hot topics on this channel and in the news media. It's easy to think this triad constitutes China's most significant problem. But no, there's another deadly crisis that threatens the eastern nation as we know it. That is the water crisis. The current water crisis that China is facing might possibly be the biggest threat the country has on its hands. How bad is it, you ask? Well, it's this bad.
One of the worst droughts seen.
A record-breaking drought.
China's record heat wave and drought.
Hydropower reservoirs are currently down by as much as half.
Emergency measures to save electricity have come into effect.
With insufficient irrigation, crops here are dying. More than 350,000 people in rural Chongqing are suffering because of the shortage of water supplies.
Let's dive more into detail on China's dry spell and the CCP's role in worsening the situation. The truth that the CCP has hidden for many years but is now coming to light as an unavoidable catastrophe is that China is on the brink of collapse due to a water crisis. On top of internal incompetence by government officials, a multi-year drought, the worst China has seen in years, threatens to topple the country's already COVID-pummeled economy. Water has always been a big factor to look out for in China, and that is more apparent now than ever. According to the United Nations, though China is home to 21% of the world's population, it contains only 7% of the world's fresh water supplies. Ironically, most of these water supplies are located in southern China and not in its northern part where most of the population lives. At first, this might seem like a minuscule problem. It's just water after all, one might say. But as a former British diplomat and China expert Charlie Parton noted in 2018, China can print money, but they can't print water. It's either you have it or you don't. And, well, China doesn't have it. This is quite a problem for a nation that currently consumes 10 billion barrels of water per day. For comparison's sake, this is about 700 times its daily oil consumption. Yeah, let that sink in. One could arguably say water has been the silent hero behind China's decades of explosive economic growth, as it is essential for growing food, generating energy, and sustaining humanity. With as big an industrial sector as China has, this shortage of water is slowing down the economy and resulting in the closure of essential plants all over the nation. All this will serve to lower the forecasts on China's already meager growth predictions, further pushing the country into a full-blown recession. Now, with the drought and heat wave in full force, not only China but the United States and the rest of the world are likely to feel the effects of China's troubles. This is because, as the rivers and lakes dry out and the heat wave continues, that condition is going to have a significant effect on China's food and power production. Moreover, given China's scale as the second largest global power, this situation could also induce global food and industrial materials shortages on a far greater scale than we've ever seen in recent times. Given the country's overriding importance to the global economy, potential water-driven disruptions beginning in China would rapidly reverberate through food, energy, and material markets around the world and create economic and political turbulence for years to come. So yes, even you in the United States might end up being affected by Chinese droughts. To make the situation worse, the underground water supply simply can't help the thirsty population. A 2018 analysis of surface water by China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment found that 19% was classified as unfit for human consumption, and roughly 7% was unfit for any use at all. The quality of groundwater, which is critical for ensuring water supplies during droughts like the one China is currently facing, is worse. Over 30% of China's underground water is deemed unfit for human consumption, and 16% is deemed unfit for any use at all. Data from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization indicates that China uses nearly 2.5 times as much fertilizer and 4 times as much pesticides as the United States does, despite having 25% less arable land. A new study finds chemicals are often used inefficiently on small farms in China. Land and migration policies may help explain why the country uses 30% of the world's fertilizers and pesticides on 9% of global cropland. This could potentially have played a role in polluting their underground reservoirs. Where the CCP falls at fault is that for decades, Beijing has generally chosen to conceal the full extent of China's environmental problems to limit potential public backlash. In avoiding questions relating to their competence, the CCP has let the country fall into ruin. This lack of transparency, on top of droughts that China now faces, has resulted in the current mess. When we look at this water crisis scenario, it presents itself as two large problems in one. What makes it worse is that they spill from China's borders to the whole world. Let's run through them.
This year, extreme heat has severely damaged crops in India. Crop yields are falling globally, and there are more dire predictions.
Nearly 830 million people around the world went hungry in 2021. That's up nearly 50 million the year before.
Scorched, you see, certainly cannot grow. The high temperature is slowly roasting the sweet potato leaves to death.
China is taking emergency action, but the leaves and stems continue to die.
The first and most obvious problem that is likely to be faced is there's going to be a food crisis in the absence of water resources. A quick look into Chinese history reveals that famines due to droughts have helped topple at least 5 of China's 17 dynasties. This is because hunger and food shortages tend to remove whatever inhibitors people may have. Fully aware of this, the CCP has heavily emphasized maximizing grain production to ensure food security. This has resulted in policies where the government incentivizes farmers to maximize the production of corn, rice, and wheat to achieve self-sufficiency levels. The problem is, to sustain these harvests, farms and cities are pumping water far faster than nature can replenish it. Satellite data suggests that each year between 2003 and 2010, North China lost an amount of groundwater equal to more than twice of what Beijing consumes annually. And yes, that's a lot of water. As groundwater levels fall, many farmers are struggling to find new resources. Some are digging larger, deeper wells, often at a great cost. But continual overdraws may render water physically inaccessible, regardless of the pumper's willingness to spend on deeper wells and new pumping technology. Add to that the fact that underground water in China is contaminated and unsuitable, and the problem becomes even bigger. This could lead to a whole food crisis. Statistics show that if the North China Plain were to suffer a 33% crop loss because of water insufficiency, China would potentially need to compensate by importing approximately 20% of the world's internationally traded corn and 13% of its traded wheat. Typically, this would cause an imbalance in food imports globally, but such a scenario is not out of the realm of possibility, considering that a drought in early 2022 slashed Argentina's expected corn crop by 33%. To add to the problems, if the Chinese drought increases and affects the rice yields in southern China or Heilongjiang, it could create even larger market shocks given China's disproportionate share of rice consumption. And this is particularly so because all 3 major staple grains are critical for hundreds of millions of lower-income consumers worldwide. In previous videos, I've covered how China is already hoarding a large amount of the world's grain supply. If the water crisis and the drought persist, however, even with their stores, China could still be subjected to a multi-year yield shortfall. Such a scenario would result in China increasing its imports of grain from the global markets. As we witnessed when they hoarded the grain they now already have, such an action could trigger food price spikes in high-income countries. This would lead to shortages in those countries, resulting in widespread hunger globally. Also, as China buys up reserves to compensate for the shortfalls at home, they will render a lot of basics inaccessible to hundreds of millions of people in poorer countries, who can't afford a global food price war. As I've mentioned before, though the drought is in China and the water crisis is a failure on the CCP's part, the effects of this are going to be global. With China focusing on the preservation of its people, it seems the world is the one that is going to foot the bill for China's misfortunes. in particular, the poorer countries in the world. Furthermore, China's water crisis isn't only limited to its agricultural sector. No. It reaches beyond to affect other sectors as well, maybe even in a bigger capacity. Let's take a look at that.
The provinces in China's northeast are suffering some of the country's worst power cuts, with cities plunged into darkness lasting hours.
Shanghai is switching off the lights along its famous Bund riverfront.
Power crunch in some parts of China has shut down factories and left some households without electricity.
Factories that are suppliers to companies like Tesla, big polysilicon makers for solar panels, big lithium battery makers for EVs, they've had to reduce or shut down production because of this.
China has the largest energy sector in the world. With the kind of population China has and the size of its industrial sector, this doesn't come as a surprise. The challenge is that a lot of this power is hydroelectric, meaning they capitalize on the larger quantities of water to generate electricity. Even the other stations that take advantage of nuclear power also require water to cool reactor cores and used fuel rods. This is why almost all the Chinese power stations are built on banks of large water bodies, or at least somewhere close where they can easily access large water quantities. Now, with the rivers and lakes drying up due to the drought, most of these power stations have been forced to shut down, as they can no longer operate. Amidst the mortgage, property, and Taiwan crisis, this is only serving to show the weakness of the CCP. If China keeps closing down factories, and it loses just 15% of its hydropower production in a year because of low water levels behind dams, it would have to increase electricity output by an equal amount to what Egypt generates in a year to compensate. The only way to do that would be to use coal-fired plants. This will have the intended short-term effects, but in the long run, it will roll back their environmental progress and further increase the same contamination that has ruined their underground receivers. Oh, and did I mention just how water-intensive coal mining is? And you really can't have a running coal plant with limited coal, now can you? It's a losing situation however you look at it. This reduction in power output in China has the citizens feeling the brunt of the impact the most. This is causing anger, because amidst a heat wave, the government has chosen to limit electricity supply to the masses and even close factories like those of Toyota. People can barely use air conditioning systems. Beijing has, however, given special preferences to Tesla by allowing them to continue operating at capacity at the expense of their citizens. Something that the people aren't too happy about.
We cannot live through this summer without air conditioning.
Yeah, it's hot as hell. I'm melting.
It could affect residents and those that need to use the water.
Power crunch in some parts of China has shut down factories.
China does not have enough power to keep its factories running.
How did Tesla manage to get what it wanted in terms of its foray into China?
Wanted to be at the forefront of electric vehicles, made China more willing to negotiate with Tesla and to give them their turn.
When you consider that, at present, China is by far the world's largest producer of aluminum, ferrosilicon, lead, manganese, magnesium, zinc, most rare earth materials, and many other specialty metals and materials, you will see that there is an incoming problem. Power outages in even a single region can move global markets, a fact that Europe car makers discovered in late 2021 when power shortages curtailed magnesium smelter operations in Shanxi province, responsible for about 50% of global output. As magnesium inventories plummeted, prices spiked to 7 times their normal level at the beginning of the year, causing global problems in supply. Now, with all these key components at risk of a limited supply due to China's problems, there are likely going to be global supply chain challenges, as industrial facilities account for over 65% of electricity use in China. Blackouts by decree would disrupt several key material supplies, as we have already begun to see with the closure of factories. It is setting itself up as quite the great pending global catastrophe. Chinese officials are not oblivious to the direness of the disaster they have on their hands. The government, back in 2003, even launched the $60 billion South to North Water Transfer Project, which draws water from tributaries of the Yangtze River to replenish the dry north. This was part of a scheme to draw water from the south of China, where most of the freshwater supplies are, to bring it to northern China, where most of the population lives. In addition, they've also deployed aircrafts and rockets to lace clouds with silver iodide, or liquid nitrogen, a process known as cloud seeding to boost rainfall. Other measures like relocating heavy industry away from the most water-stressed regions, along with massive investments in water management infrastructure, have been taken as well. In April of this year, the Vice Minister of Water Resources, Wei Xianxiong, estimated that annual investment in water-related projects could hit $100 billion. This shows the kind of effort that is being put into trying to solve the problem. However, in the face of the drought being faced, all this seems to be for naught. The harsh truth is that China's potential way out of this predicament is bounded by harsh economic, physical, and political realities. Economic solutions like the desalinization of water are proving too expensive, with very little to show for it. Physical solutions like the transfer of water from the south to the north are nigh impossible and also very expensive. Maybe above all of this, the CCP wants to protect its political power and image. Certain measures, though potentially effective, if they harm the CCP's preferred narrative of economic progress, are completely ruled out. At some point, the lines between maintaining power and actually improving citizens' lives are blurred. The whole world now waits to see what becomes of China's situation. And if the situation persists, then it will be clear that the rest of the world is on a deadline too. This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. More on them later in the video. China wants Russia to win the Ukrainian war. This is far from obvious, since the CCP is trying to sound as neutral as possible. When we read the statements from the Chinese government's website on Ukraine, we see talk about sovereignty, peace talks, and resolving the humanitarian crisis. Not exactly what a bunch of staunch Putin supporters would say. But what if I tell you that this is just a facade to hide China's true intentions? Secretly, the country is giving Russia some of the most important resources for the war. China is Russia's biggest gunpowder supplier, single-handedly keeping Russia's ammunition factories afloat. Meanwhile, it provides no gunpowder to Ukraine or its allies, who are in desperate shortage. But this should come as no surprise. Shortly before the invasion started, Putin visited Xi Jinping and signed a no-limits partnership. In their joint document, the two criticized the US by name 6 times and opposed NATO's expansion. Later, reports from the New York Times suggested that China already knew about the invasion before it signed the document. Understandably, this has led to fears that China would help Putin in the Ukraine war. After all, their joint document said, and I quote, "There are no forbidden areas of cooperation." Although Beijing still refrains from giving direct lethal aid, it's definitely clear on which side it's on. As the biggest competitor of the United States, China kind of likes what Russia is doing. So let's take a deep dive into how China is secretly trying to make Russia win, and why it would want to do this in the first place.
This factory in Pennsylvania is making Ukraine's most important ammunition. 155mm rounds are basically giant bullets used in artillery guns.
Military officials estimate that Ukraine needs 200,000 a month to actually fight this war, to keep on par with Russia, and US capacity at somewhere around 28,000.
Biggest problem is we don't have enough of ammunition for it.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned that China may soon provide lethal assistance in the form of weapons and ammunition to Russia's war in Ukraine.
First off, let's look at the situation in Ukraine. Over the last year or so, the conflict has turned into an artillery war. The front lines entered into a stalemate, and very little territory changed hands. A lot of attention is now going to the artillery campaigns, which are doing heavy damage on both sides. With artillery, you can damage enemy positions, armor, and supply lines at relatively low cost, and eventually just drain them out. Currently, about 70% of the losses in the conflict are because of artillery shelling. Eventually, a breakthrough could be possible if either Russia or Ukraine runs out of resources or soldiers. Putin is betting that Ukraine will lose this war of attrition, and he has some of the numbers on his side. First of all, he has way more people to send to the battlefield because of Russia's larger population. Winning with sheer amount of manpower is a proven tactic in Russia, going back to World War II. But what's really scary is the ammunition advantage that Russia has. Currently, the Russian military is firing 7 times more artillery shells than Ukraine, according to the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister. This is due to an increasing ammunition shortage on the Ukrainian side. It wasn't always like this, though, as it has changed significantly over the last months. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine was using around 7,000 artillery shells a day, much more than Russia's 5,000. But at the beginning of 2024, Ukraine only used 2,000 rounds a day, while Russia doubled its figure to 10,000. There's a little bit of nuance, though, as Ukraine's artillery has proven to be much more effective. Ukraine has been destroying 4 Russian howitzers for every 1 it loses. Because it has a technology edge, it can trace down and destroy enemy firing positions way more effectively. But the scary thing about Russia is that it doesn't care. If Ukraine is 4 times more effective, Russia will just fire 5 times more shells, and there's nothing much Ukraine's allies can do about this. The NATO alliance isn't able to produce enough ammunition, which resulted in dwindling supplies for Ukraine. Russia is producing 3 times more artillery shells than the United States and Europe combined. The nation makes 250,000 shells a month, or about 3 million shells every year. In comparison, the US only has a monthly production of 28,000. The process of upgrading this capacity will take quite a while, because the infrastructure is simply not there yet. To get to Russia's level of production, the West needs billions of dollars and several months, if not years, of construction. The US plans to increase its shell production to 100,000 a month in 2025. But it's not clear whether this will be in time to help Ukraine. NATO could run out of its ammunition supply, with disastrous consequences. The United States has already sent hundreds of thousands of shells from its strategic stockpiles to Ukraine. All over the world, Washington has ammunition reserves to back its military presence abroad. And these reserves formed a big part of Ukraine's supply. In 2023, the US transferred 300,000 shells from South Korea and 300,000 shells from Israel to Ukraine. The problem is that this can't go on forever. The US doesn't want to become too weak in other regions, meaning that this lifeline could be nearing its end. What makes ammunition problems even worse is that the resources for shell production are in short supply. The most concerning shortage has to be with gunpowder. But before we dive into that, I have a gift for you guys. I'm sure you love geopolitics, and that's why you're watching this video. It's the same reason why I think you guys would love today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. It's a military-themed PvP strategy game where you choose a real country to lead in modern global warfare up against 128 other players. You can use many different units to build up your army. Tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, whatever you need to engage in epic battles or build alliances all over the world. When you're watching the videos, you can think about geopolitics. And when you're not watching the videos, you can make sure that your country in Conflict of Nations is a geopolitical leader in your world. My favorite feature is the fact that I can play this on PC and my phone. That means I'm always on it, staying ahead of my competition. Best of all, you can use the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't lose out. I will see you guys in the game. All right, now back to the video. According to the French President Macron, this is one of the key problems that the NATO alliance has at the moment. He said that, quote, powder is really what's lacking today. The European Union promised to supply 1 million shells to Ukraine, but it could really only deliver about 30% of this number. The lack of gunpowder is one of the main causes for this failure. Without gunpowder, you can't create the propellant charge needed for artillery rounds. NATO's shortage of gunpowder can be traced back to one chemical called nitrocellulose, or gun cotton. This is where China comes in. According to an EU International Market Commissioner, China is a major gun cotton supplier to the West. Well, at least it used to be. Just a few months ago, the country suddenly halted its gun cotton exports to the West. You would almost think that it purposely tried to create an ammunition shortage. Although the West does have its own nitrocellulose facilities in the US, Germany, and France, it's not enough to keep up with demand. And these suspicions of China causing this shortage get even worse. Last year, the New York Times uncovered huge gunpowder exports from a private Chinese company to Russia. The state-owned company, called Polytechnologies, exported gunpowder to Russia ammunition factories. And not just like a little bit. It was enough gunpowder to produce at least 80 million rounds of ammunition. So this proves two things. China has an enormous gunpowder manufacturing capability, and it would rather sell it to Russia than to Ukraine. Polytechnologies claims that the gunpowder wasn't for military purposes. But I mean, you can decide for yourself if you think that's believable. Russia itself produces very little nitrocellulose, so it desperately needs imports to maintain its gunpowder supply. Along with Turkish companies reselling Western-made gun cotton to Russia, China has played a vital role in providing this resource. According to a British-Ukrainian research group, China is now the largest nitrocellulose supplier to Russia. It uncovered 72 deliveries worth of over $10 million. And if you think about it, the true Chinese supply of nitrocellulose might even be bigger. If China supplies Russia with gunpowder, it would want to do this as secretly as possible. The US and the European Union have already sanctioned several Chinese firms because of their role in the Ukraine war. And to prevent this, China might disguise its gun cotton exports as normal civilian products. This aligns with information from the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Several US intelligence briefings were leaked on a Discord server showing some very interesting information. An intercept of Russian intelligence revealed a deal with China to supply lethal military aid. The only provision was that the trade would have to remain secret. If the deal went through, there may be even more gun cotton exports that we don't know about. Understandably, this has raised some alarm bells in Washington. The US has warned China against helping Russia, saying that there would be, quote-unquote, real costs. But these developments don't come as a huge surprise. There are many other ways China is helping its northern neighbor. China exports large amounts of dual-use technology to Russia, things that can have both civilian and military applications. For example, one Russian company bought 100,000 bulletproof vests and 100,000 helmets from a manufacturer in Shanghai. Obviously, these enormous quantities can only have one goal: to equip the Russian soldiers, but it's very hard to prove this, because they get labeled as things like airsoft helmets. Other dual-use products include ceramics, drones, and thermal optics. Ceramics are not only used for mugs and plates and so on, but also for military purposes. Because the material is so strong, you can find it in armored vehicles and body armor. In 2023, China sold $227 million worth of ceramics to Russia, up from the $135 million the year before. And one thing is for sure, this is not because teacups have gotten so popular in Moscow. A noteworthy detail is that China only exported $5 million of ceramics to Ukraine in 2023. This was less than a quarter of the $23 million before the war. Once again, China is favoring Russia. We can also see this in the exports of drones, which are also dual-use products. You can use them just for fun, or to discover enemy positions and drop grenades on them. China has long been a drone supplier to Russia, with $115 million worth of exports in 2023. But for Ukraine, it's a different story. China sold Ukraine $15 million worth of drones in 2021, but that came crashing down to just $3 million in 2023. Ukraine used to get cheap drones from China and then turn them into useful military tools. However, China noticed this and restricted its drone exports to Ukraine. This was to prevent them being used for quote-unquote non-peaceful purposes. Meanwhile, Beijing turns a blind eye to Russian drone purchases, even when they are explicitly labeled for special military operations. Semiconductors are another Chinese dual-use export to Russia, which surged from $200 million to $500 million after the war. Interestingly, Hong Kong is also a part of this technology lifeline to Russia, It supplied $400 million worth of chips in 2022 alone. Not only does this help Russia deal with the economic impact of the sanctions, but it is also vital for many defense systems. In Russian drones and tanks, the Ukrainians are finding increasingly more Chinese-made electronics. China is also providing support on the logistics side of Russia's war effort. In December of 2022, super heavy truck shipments to Russia were up by 1,143%. You need those trucks to move heavy military equipment to the front lines. And if we really dig deep, we can find another way China is secretly supporting Russia. I mean, literally, dig deep. Russian imports of shoveling equipment and excavators from China were up 100% and 200% respectively. Although it doesn't seem obvious, this is also dual-use technology. Russia is using these as trench digging equipment for the more than 600 miles, or around 1,000-kilometer, front line. Of course, this is something that China gladly helped them with. But the most effective way that China is supporting Russia may be this. With machinery, China is helping Russia to expand its military-industrial base. In 2023, 90% of Russia's $900 million machine tool imports came from China. This bypasses sanctions from other machinery exporters like Germany and the United States. The Chinese products will be used to build Russia's war economy, something that's worrying NATO. Russia is rapidly increasing its production capacity, with 520,000 new people being employed in its defense manufacturing since the start of the war. And through trade in gun cotton and dual-use products, Russia can also rely on China's defense industry. This makes its industrial base for a war of attrition even stronger. Both Xi Jinping and Putin realize that the conflict could be won this way, because it's one of NATO's weak points. NATO has the money, but not the factories and the supply chains, especially in the case of shells and gun cotton. This is very unfortunate. According to European defense officials, the few factories that it has are already running at full capacity. It will take 3 years to increase gunpowder production, because the supply lines for all kinds of raw materials are just not there yet. It would be a huge blunder for NATO to lose the war in Ukraine over this. But when we look at what's happened over the past 80 years, this was bound to happen. In terms of quality, the West's military has gotten more advanced than ever. But in quantity, there has been a huge decline. During the World Wars, the US and European countries had huge factories for artillery shells and gunpowder. The US in particular proved itself as an industrial powerhouse. During World War II, it created 41.4 billion rounds of small ammunition, enough to shoot every human alive at the time 10 times. Yes, they went a little bit over the top. In US ammunition production alone, 250,000 people were working in the 25 assembly plants and 23 propellant and explosive plants. In total, ammunition factories were the size of New York City, Philadelphia, and Chicago combined. But after the World Wars ended, the United States, and especially Europe, lost a lot of their military-industrial capabilities. This was driven by a decrease in spending, which made large-scale ammunition production unfeasible. Governments and defense manufacturers didn't want to invest in expensive factories. When we look at these charts of German, French, and British defense spending as a percentage of GDP, it becomes obvious. They went from spending 4 to 7% of GDP on their militaries in 1960 to somewhere between 1 and 2% now. Ultimately, this meant that they didn't place enough orders for ammunition. And after all, why would they? There seemed to be no threat anymore after the Cold War ended. So military expenditures were just a waste of money. And if things go really south, there's always the protection of the United States under the NATO alliance. The US retained some of its military-industrial power, as it still has the strongest military in the world. But for America, the priority anymore wasn't to fight wars with huge front lines and large artillery campaigns. After the World Wars, the US didn't really fight enemies with similar capabilities. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the opposing armies were smaller and less sophisticated. That's how it ended up with a monthly shell production of just 28,000. More wasn't really necessary. As a result, the US and NATO were a little bit surprised with the current war in Ukraine. A war of attrition with just more than a 600-mile, about 1,000-kilometer long front line hasn't been fought in decades. Just for comparison, one day in Ukraine is an entire month in Afghanistan in terms of ammunition consumption. To fight the proxy war with Russia, NATO needs to adapt, something that takes a long time. By providing resources and machinery, China is giving its ally the means to take advantage of this. With a larger military production quantity, Moscow has a bigger chance of achieving a victory. Now that we know how China is involved in the war in Ukraine, we can move on to why it has even chosen to do so. There are a few reasons why China would want Russia to sustain or even win the war in Ukraine. The most obvious reason is perhaps the Taiwan war scenario. Russia's proxy war with the NATO alliance depletes the West's resources, which is exactly what China needs for a possible attack on Taiwan. Most experts agree that China isn't able to invade Taiwan at the moment because of strong US defenses in the area. But now, the West needs to give all of its attention to Ukraine, which has a direct effect on East Asia. There is currently a $19 billion arms sales backlog of Taiwanese orders for US aircraft and tanks. This is partially because America has sent so much equipment to Ukraine. When China sends gunpowder to Russia, it will enable the Russian military to destroy even more American-made equipment. This will worsen the arms sales backlog to Taiwan. Additionally, the Ukraine war can also have a more subtle effect on the Taiwan war scenario. A NATO defeat on a European battlefield would have huge consequences. It could demoralize and weaken the alliance, giving China an advantage in Taiwan. The NATO allies may not want to get into another costly conflict with huge economic consequences. Apart from the Taiwan invasion, there are more geopolitical motives to take in mind. China now has a lot of influence in Russia due to the war, perhaps reaching excessive levels. After the sanctions hit, China has stepped in to become the biggest trade partner of Russia. In 2023, bilateral trade between the two hit a record $240 billion. Half of Russia's oil and petroleum exports now go to China, and Russia has become China's largest crude oil supplier. Liquefied natural gas exports to China have jumped 47% in 2023, and Russia is selling record amounts at the moment. Even though energy revenues are down, China, together with India, is providing a lifeline for this crucial Russian industry. And for the import market, China is just as important. As you can see on this chart, Russia's imports nearly halved following the invasion. This was mainly because of sanctions from the European Union, which was Russia's biggest import partner at the time. But now, imports are back to their usual levels. China is the sole reason for this increase, with about 70% of Russia's imports coming from the country. Right now, Russia is buying so much from Chinese companies that shipping containers are piling up. The imports include large amounts of raw materials, chemicals, and industrial goods like machinery, things that Russia needs after the sanctions. Basically, China has been a lifesaver for Russian industries. On top of that, half of the Chinese goods are consumer-oriented, including fashion brands or cars. Since 2019, Chinese car sales in Russia have increased by 900%. But with these growing economic ties, there is one thing that stands out. For Russia, China is an economic lifeline, being both the biggest import and export partner. But for China, the story's a little bit different. In 2023, Russia made up only 3.4% of China's exports and 5.5% of imports. The economic relations are so unbalanced that some argue that Russia has become a Chinese vassal state. But there's one catch. If China wants to retain its influence in Russia, the current regime must stay in power. Putin needs to win the war by getting at least some territory, or otherwise he will lose his support. Starting a war and then losing it is never received well by the populace. So, to wrap it all up, China is far from neutral in the Ukraine war. Although the country likes to say it only wants peace, it has way too many reasons to be on Putin's side. As we've uncovered, China is already helping its neighbor through massive gunpowder exports, dual-use products, and machinery. The gunpowder trade in particular is fueling Russia's war effort. This cooperation could turn out to be very successful, because the two strategic partners have found a weakness in NATO's industrial capacity. Lastly, remember you can use the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free for Conflict of Nations. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't lose out. I'll see you guys in the game. China has gained control of multiple strategic assets of many countries across the world, one of which is so crucial that it controls 80% of global trade. The control of these assets has even put the economy and sovereignty of many countries in danger.
Belt and Road.
Belt and Road, Belt and Road.
Model after the original Silk Road.
Developing countries will be at the center of that.
Connect Asia, Africa, and Europe.
What's ahead for Belt and Road?
China has gained control over multiple ports across the world. But this turn of events didn't happen overnight. China has been working on this for years. Ports form a critical part of the global supply chain. And when you control the ports, you have control over global trade, which is exactly what China is doing. As of 2023, China has stakes in more than 92 ports across the world. And let me tell you that these do not include the ports in China itself. This is an extremely alarming situation, not only for the countries with the Chinese ports, but for global trade itself. On top of that, in the name of infrastructure development, China is turning many of these ports into its naval bases, a huge threat for every country in the region. But countries have started realizing these threats, and many have even started backing off from these projects. China initially had 101 overseas port projects, but as of 2023, this number has dropped to 92 projects, 9 less port projects than they wanted. Each of these 9 had its own reasons to be canceled or suspended. So, in this video, let's see how China gained control of some of the most critical ports of the world, why it's a huge threat for the countries with these Chinese ports, and how these countries are fighting to stop the Chinese takeover. But before we start with the video, please hit that like button below, because any video on the CCP has a potential to be downvoted by CCP bots, so your likes help out the video a lot. Thank you. As of 2022, global trade hit a record value of $32 trillion. Surprisingly, more than 80% of global trade, which translates to almost $25.6 trillion worth of goods, was carried by sea. This percentage is even higher for many developing countries, and these goods need ports to be offloaded. This is the reason why ports form an integral part of the global supply chain. In fact, ports even act as a lifeline for many countries. For example, Yemen, a country which is facing one of the largest humanitarian crises, imports 90% of its food through its ports. In fact, 90% of the entire African continent's imports and exports are driven by sea. This is not just limited to the African continent. Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of wheat in the world. In the 8 months before the conflict, it shipped around 50 million tons worth of grain through its ports in the Black Sea, a quantity enough to feed around 400 million people. And these are just a few examples of how important ports are for nations and global trade. Now, imagine letting go of the control of the most critical ports of your country to Chinese companies. It seems scary, right? This is what China has done and continues to do with many countries. As of 2023, there are 92 ports with Chinese ownership, 13 of them majority owned by China, and 10 of these projects even have the potential for military use, which means China is planning to dock its naval vessels in these ports. China has been gaining the control of these ports with various methods, the most popular of which still remains the most notorious one. I'm sure you must have guessed it. John Adams, the American statesman, once said, "There are 2 ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt." And China is doing the latter. The Belt and Road Initiative, infamously known for lending heavily to countries, especially developing and underdeveloped ones, for their infrastructure projects. When a country fails to repay these loans, the Chinese companies will take control of strategic assets in that country. One of the most notorious cases is what China has done with Sri Lanka. China literally forced Sri Lanka to surrender a strategically located 4,000-acre port in the Indian Ocean region, along with 15,000 acres of surrounding land. China's dream of claiming such a critical spot in the Indian Ocean region would have remained just a dream without the Sri Lankan president and a few other politicians. This is a story of greed, power, and dominance. This is the story of the Hambantota port. The Hambantota port is located in one of the most strategic locations in the world. It sits on the key shipping route between the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal, which is the shortest and the most crucial trade route linking Asia and Europe. Back then, around 36,000 ships, including 4,500 oil tankers, used the route every year, with Colombo Port, Sri Lanka's largest port, located 200 kilometers from Hambantota Port, catering mainly to container ships. The Sri Lankan government saw a big opportunity here. They decided to build Hambantota Port to provide other services to international shipping, including refueling, repair work, and facilities for changing crews. But Sri Lanka didn't have enough funds to completely fund the project on its own. So, it asked for help. But most of the countries rejected lending to Sri Lanka, since the country's economy was already in turmoil. Most countries saw the Hambantota port as a commercially unviable project. This is where everyone's beloved and dear friend came to help Sri Lanka. You've already guessed it, it's the generous state of China. China has invested in a lot of long-term projects in Sri Lanka, including Hambantota Port. China gave out a $1.3 billion loan to Sri Lanka for this port. As usual, this port witnessed the same pattern every BRI project witnesses. The company that got the contract was a Chinese company. The inducted workers were Chinese. And these workers were paid from the same money China had lent to Sri Lanka for this port. So technically, most of the money was flowing back to China. If we talk about the port, 85% of the funds, around $1.3 billion required for the project, were lent by China, and the remaining 15% were given by the SLPA, or Sri Lanka Ports Authority, making the project an overall $1.5 billion project. The construction was carried out by China Harbor Engineering Company and the Sino Hydro Corporation, both of which are Chinese companies. The construction of the port began in 2008, and its Phase 1, for which China generously charged an interest rate of 6.3% as compared to 1.2% rates offered by the IMF and the World Bank. Why Sri Lanka still accepted the loans is something we'll discuss in detail in later parts of the video, but for now, let's go back to Sri Lanka's story. So, Phase 1 of the project was completed in 2010, with port operations beginning in 2011. Phase 2 of the project began in 2012 and was completed by 2015. The port was fully fledged, ready to tap the huge opportunity it had. But things didn't really go as planned. The Hambantota port was failing. The Hambantota port was unable to generate sufficient revenue due to inadequate governance, lack of commercial and industrial activities, and its inability to attract passing vessels to dock at the port. This was mostly because the ships chose the more advanced Colombo port instead of the Hambantota port, which was just 200 kilometers away from it. When the first phase of the port became operational, it attracted only 34 ships in 2012, as compared to 3,667 ships at the Colombo port. After the construction of the second phase, the situation didn't really improve. On average, the port witnessed visits by only about 400 vessels annually, as compared to average of 4,000 vessels annually by the port of Colombo. The port started suffering losses. By the end of 2016, total losses had mounted to $304 million, while the debt was ballooning. Sri Lanka had to repay nearly $1.7 billion to China as principal and interest for the loan. The debt repayment for this loan around 2015 was close to about $100 million annually. Well, guess what? Our dear friend China came along once again and, using the pretext of recurring losses, designed a public-private partnership scheme to manage and operate the port. Sri Lanka had no option but to take one of the most difficult decisions it had ever taken. In December of 2016, the Sri Lankan government decided to restructure the port in collaboration with China Merchants Port Holdings Company, or CM Port, to make it commercially viable. Two new entities were created: the Hambantota International Port Group, HIPG, and Hambantota International Port Services Company Limited, HIPS. Now, HIPG would develop and manage the port along with the adjoining land, while HIPS would operate the port services. The Chinese entity, CM Port, invested $1.12 billion for the acquisition of an 85% stake in HIPG and a 52% stake in HIPS, with the remaining stakes given to the Sri Lankan Port Authority. This brought the total Chinese ownership in the Hambantota port to about 70%. So now China had the majority ownership of this project, and it also has the authority to operate the port. But for how many years? Is it 10, 20, or 30 years? Well, none of these. China leased the port for 99 friggin' years. Yeah, you heard that right, 99 years. But the twist doesn't end there. Interestingly, there was no change in Sri Lanka's debt obligations for this project, even after the Chinese acquisition. This is because China didn't waive off the loan in exchange for the port, but instead invested $1.2 billion for the acquisition, with these funds sent to the Sri Lankan treasury, which it may have used for other purposes. While taking over the port, both HIPG and HIPS, the entities with majority Chinese stake, did not inherit any liability. And so the government of Sri Lanka is still liable for the debt and still continues to repay the debt despite handing over the port to China. And that is how China gained control over a strategic port for not 10, not 20, but 99 years. Now, you must be wondering, during all this chaos, wasn't the Sri Lankan leadership aware of these Chinese tactics? Well, it turns out that the Sri Lankan leadership at that time was completely aware of these Chinese tactics. And there was one person who was responsible for all of this chaos. In fact, under his leadership, from 2005 to 2015, the country's debt increased threefold, from $15 billion to $44.8 billion. This is where one of China's ugliest strategies comes into play. That is, to bribe the decision makers and make sure they stay in power as long as possible. In the case of Sri Lanka, China bribed the leadership to such an extent that the president of Sri Lanka was literally called a puppet of China. Every major decision he took was heavily influenced by China. This man, who stayed in power for 10 years and literally destroyed Sri Lanka's economy, was none other than Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Mahinda Rajapaksa looked invincible. His grip on power was absolute. He controlled the parliament. His family controlled 75% of the country's budget.
During Mr. Rajapaksa's tenure, he and his three brothers controlled many government ministries and around 80% of total government spending. So it became easy for China to bribe them and get things done in favor of Chinese interests. The influence of China grew so much that the Chinese entities got their work done without any hassles and at exorbitant prices. This is because during the construction of the Hambantota port, there was a large boulder that partially blocked the entrance, which prevented large ships like oil tankers from entering the port. But during construction, this was not taken into consideration. The port was built, and in 2010, on Rajapaksa's birthday, this port was open for ships despite nothing being done about this boulder. Only a year later, China Harbor blasted the boulder. But what was fishy was the cost of blasting this boulder. China Harbor charged an astonishing $40 million to do this job. This gave rise to many speculations whether the company was overcharging or this price tag included kickbacks to Rajapaksa. In another case, Rajapaksa approved an international airport named Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, which was financed by China's EXIM Bank. This project was bound to fail because just $6,000 were spent on the airport's feasibility study. But more than $80,000 was spent on a lavish ceremony that included dancers and singers to prematurely open Hambantota port on Rajapaksa's birthday. This shows Mr. Rajapaksa's dedication towards China. And well, China didn't stop here. China also tried to influence the elections in Sri Lanka. According to a government investigation, during the 2015 elections in Sri Lanka, large payments from the Chinese Port Construction Fund flowed directly to campaign aids and activities for Rajapaksa's party. Around $7.6 million were transferred from China Harbour's account to affiliates of Rajapaksa's campaign. And as we saw, China Harbour is the same company that built Hambantota Port. In fact, just 10 days before the elections, around $3.7 million was distributed in checks, which were used for promotional activity, distributing gifts to people, and funding popular figures who were supporting Rajapaksa's party. Guess what? Most of the payments were made from a sub-account controlled by none other than China Harbour. Well, Sri Lanka isn't the only country. China has been doing this in many countries. Some of these attempts failed miserably because China was caught offering bribes. One of them is actually extremely hilarious. In Bangladesh, China Harbour was accused of bribing an official at the Ministry of Roads. They did this by stuffing $100,000 into a tea box. And while that sounds funny, it's just China things, you know? In the end, Bangladesh banned China Harbour from securing any future contracts. The second incident took place in 2009 in the Philippines, where China Harbour's parent company, China Communications Construction Company, was banned for 8 years from bidding on World Bank projects because of corrupt practices. Coming back to the Sri Lanka story, Mahinda Rajapaksa put Sri Lanka's economy in a fragile situation, with anti-Chinese and anti-Rajapaksa sentiments extremely high. The opposition party leader, Maithripala Sirisena, won the election because he promised to kick China out of the country and cancel many Chinese projects. As he promised, he canceled many Chinese projects and tried to bring Sri Lanka on track. But the damage was already too high, which not only impacted Sri Lanka, but also became a concern for China's biggest rival in the region, India.
Experts call the Yuan Wong 5 a spy ship. 222 meters long, about 25 meters wide. It has at least 4 satellites and multiple antennas. The Yuan Wong ships can in fact track ballistic missile trajectories. They can monitor satellite and space vehicle launches, and that's what makes these ships a critical part of China's missile and space program. The US Defense Department says these ships belong to the PLA's Strategic Support Force. A challenge to India, this vessel can be used to spy on multiple strategic assets in India. The Indian Navy is believed to be keeping a close eye on the Chinese ship. India and Sri Lanka are deepening ties, but clearly that's not enough to counter the Chinese influence effectively. Try to look at this from Sri Lanka's point of view. It must keep both India and China in good humor. It needs a bailout from the IMF. Sri Lanka needs that money urgently, and that will not happen until China restructures its loans to Sri Lanka.
On the 16th of August, 2022, a Chinese ship named Yuan Wang 5 entered the Hambantota port. Sri Lanka and China referred to this ship as a scientific research ship. Well, the USA and India became extremely cautious after this move. This ship was operated by the PLA Strategic Support Force, who used it for military purposes, despite being registered as a marine scientific research vessel. Later, it turned out that this ship's actual purpose was to track satellites and missiles with a range of 750 kilometers, which means it had the ability to track activities in multiple Indian states in the south. Later, other Chinese ships and submarines were also welcomed by Sri Lanka in Hambantota. So, China has gained 2 crucial advantages through this port. One, it has gotten access to one of the most critical ports in the Indian Ocean region, very near to the most critical trade route, the route between the Suez Canal and the Malacca Strait. This is because roughly 80% of China's entire oil supply and roughly 90% of overall Chinese trade passes through the Malacca Strait, which China always fears that India might block the Malacca Strait choke point in case of a conflict. If this happens, you can just imagine the situation in China. This is the reason China has taken a lot of steps to safeguard its oil supplies. one of which is the Hambantota port. Number 2, this port has become a key part of China's string of pearls strategy, a network of ports and military infrastructure China is building to encircle its biggest rival in the Indian Ocean region, India. Hambantota is one of the closest points, being located just a few hundred kilometers from India. Though things are changing, with the USA and India taking multiple steps to beat China in the Indian Ocean region. We will discuss all these in a few moments, but before that, let's have a look at how China used the debt trap strategy for another country not too far from Sri Lanka, where they repeated the same thing. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy. No one was ready to fund big amounts of their infrastructure projects, so China lent them a huge amount of money. As usual, they failed to repay and had no choice but to hand over their assets to China, including a strategically located port, for 40 years. This country is none other than Pakistan.
Beijing is developing Gwadar as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC.
Since gaining independence, Pakistan has been extremely unstable politically. Sometimes the head of state is an elected leader. Sometimes it's a military general who snatched power with a military coup. This instability became a major reason why no companies are willing to invest significantly in Pakistan. In this power struggle, Pakistan's economy went for a toss. It faced bankruptcy several times, and so it approached the IMF for bailout packages. Not for one, not for two, but 12 frickin' times. Though it received these funds, they were meant for Pakistan's survival, not to spend on expensive infrastructure projects. Pakistan was not able to spend on its infrastructure development. Well, China was paying attention, and they saw a huge opportunity in this troubled nation. In 2015, it came with a massive regional connectivity project called the CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a part of China's BRI. Initially, CPEC had projects worth $46 billion, but as of 2017 has increased to $62 billion, with this number still expected to increase. These numbers looked really good on paper, but as you know, the contracting companies were Chinese. Their workers were Chinese, and once again, most of the money went back to China. In 2002, China Harbor Construction Company built Phase 1 of the Gwadar port at a cost of $248 million, completing it in 2006. The estimated cost of the second phase was $840 million, with most of the funding coming from China. Well, what happened next? You must be thinking that a Chinese company took the port on lease, right? Actually, no. In fact, you'd be surprised to know that in 2007, Pakistan granted the management of this port to PSA, or the Port of Singapore Authority, for a period of 40 years. Not just that. According to the agreement, the PSA also agreed to invest $550 million during the next 5 years for the port development. The Gwadar Port Authority was all set to receive 9% from cargo operations and marine services, and 15% from Gwadar Free Zone business. Even many import duties and taxes were waived off. So it was a win-win situation for everyone. The Chinese influence was countered, Pakistan got funds to develop a port, and also a business alongside it. But in 2013, Pakistan made such a decision that sent shockwaves across almost every country.
The award of this contract opens new opportunities for our people, particularly for the people of Balochistan. It gives new impetus to Pakistan-China relations.
In 2013, the management of Gwadar Port was handed over to a Chinese company named China Overseas Ports Holding Company for 43 years. According to geopolitical experts, Pakistan took this move to balance U.S. influence in the country and to seek Beijing's more active support. This is because there were tensions between the U.S. and Pakistan over America's policies in Afghanistan. 2 years later, the Gwadar port became part of the CPEC, under which China planned to extend the port's capacity and infrastructure connecting the port. China proposed expanding the current capacity of the port, which could currently handle ships weighing up to 20,000 tons, to accommodate vessels weighing up to 70,000 tons, including a floating liquefied natural gas terminal with a capacity of 500 million cubic feet of gas per day, a desalination plant, and a 2,292-acre special economic zone. In total, $1.62 billion was projected to be spent on this new infrastructure. Here too, China would take away most of the benefits. According to the agreement, Chinese port operator COPHC will get a 91% share of the revenue from the operations of the port and terminal, and 85% of the revenue generated by the free zone. Though the port is expected to handle 1 million tons of cargo annually and generate a lot of business, Pakistan would hardly receive any benefits out of it. This port is also a savior for China, since it safeguards China's energy needs. Well, how's this, you might ask? Well, it has two major reasons. One, the main reason, is again the same: the Malacca Strait choke point. With this port, China can skip this choke point to a large extent and directly transport crude oil and other energy resources from Pakistan's Gwadar port to Kashgar province in China via roadways. Number two, this port is located just 600 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz. If you haven't heard about it, it's the same choke point through which 20% of the world's crude oil and liquefied fuels pass. So having a military setup in Gwadar port acts as a deterrence against rivals of China, the major one of which is India in this region. Even this port acts as a pearl in China's string of pearls strategy. These are the major reasons why this port is so critical for China. In fact, China is so concerned about it that in 2017, it gifted 2 Chinese ships to the Pakistan Navy to safeguard the Gwadar port and adjoining trade routes. Later, 2 more ships were also provided to Pakistan. Similarly, China is going head-on with the US in the South China Sea. Some of the ports that can play a critical role in favor of China could be the Newcastle Port, Melbourne Port, and Darwin Port in Australia, ports in the Philippines, Timor-Leste, the Saigon Port in Vietnam, and its port projects in Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea. In fact, the most concerning case of all of this is that in 2015, Australia's Darwin port was given on a 99-year lease to a Chinese company, Land Bridge Group. Later, the US showed concerns regarding this move, so Australia reviewed the project and decided not to cancel this lease. Unfortunately, this is the level of influence China has. Chinese use of these ports can be detrimental, not just to the United States, but to these countries too. For instance, we witnessed the recent incident of the Chinese fighter jets encircling a Philippine aircraft during a joint patrol with Australia.
The Armed Forces of the Philippines confirms Chinese fighter jets orbited above the Philippines' Super Tucanos during its joint air patrol with Australia over the West Philippine Sea. The circling lasted for about 15 minutes and the mission was completed without incident last Sunday, November 26. The day before the incident, AFP Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. said Chinese vessels shadowed Philippine and Australian ships during joint maritime patrols in the West Philippine Sea. The AFP chief says this seems to be China's tactic, pointing out that Chinese vessels had earlier circled US and Japanese aircrafts flying over the area on a separate occasion.
China regularly keeps bullying smaller countries in some way or another. Anyway, coming back to the ports, on the Asian continent, along with all these ports, China either has stakes or handles port operations in 10 more countries that include Papua New Guinea, North Korea, Russia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Israel, and Turkey, with Chinese investments ranging anywhere between $30 million to more than $1 billion. Similarly, in the case of the African continent, China has investments in not 1, not 10, but in over 24 ports across more than 10 countries, with a total value of $20.347 billion USD. The most concerning aspect of these ports is that some of them are located very close to the world's most critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. As you know, 30 to 35% of the world's crude oil passes through these choke points. So China clearly is a threat to the world. Now, you may ask, if China is such a huge threat to the sovereignty of its borrowers, if China has and still is relentlessly distributing loans to debt-trapped countries, with so many infamous cases of debt trap out there, Why are countries still borrowing from China? In fact, many countries have ditched the IMF and the World Bank and borrowed from Chinese banks. Well, you'll be surprised to know that the interest rates of the World Bank and the IMF are around 1 to 2% with a maturity period of around 25 to 30 years. China, on the other hand, offers an interest rate of 4 to 6% and a maturity period of just 15 to 20 years. According to a report, China has lent around $1.34 trillion between 2000 and 2021 to more than 165 countries, especially low and middle-income countries. China is so cunning that they initially lend for infrastructure projects. And when the borrower countries struggle to repay these loans and need emergency rescue loans, guess who offers these loans to them? It's China, in case you didn't get that. So, ironically, China first offered huge infrastructure loans to poor countries, and then came again with a rescue loan just because they were struggling to repay them. These rescue loans increased to 58% of China's lending to low and middle-income countries in 2021, compared to just 5% in 2013. Now, there are 3 major reasons why so many countries prefer borrowing from China. And if you've already watched our video on how China is destroying countries with its dams, then you kind of already know these reasons. But if you haven't, here are the major reasons. Number 1. First, the IMF and the World Bank does not provide huge loans to countries with weak economic conditions, especially for expensive infrastructure projects. In fact, the IMF discourages poor countries from taking large commercial loans. But in the case of China, it was offering huge ticket-sized loans. So clearly, many countries just chose China. The second reason is the neoliberal and stringent conditionality of the IMF. So if a country asks for an IMF loan, then the country has to agree to the multiple IMF conditions. These include open markets, scrapping government subsidies, deregulating key sectors, privatization, and debt management. Also, the IMF would ask low-income countries to seek debt relief before they took on new loans. And countries must abide by a debt limit framework to benefit from debt relief. So, this was a headache for these poor countries. But again, China has nothing to do with where the country's economy is going and what it should and shouldn't do with their economy. So again, these low-income countries choose Chinese lenders. The third reason why countries prefer China is because China offered them something called the mixed funding model option. In this model, China lends huge amounts to low-income countries for infrastructure if reimbursement can be guaranteed by lucrative commercial projects like oil, mines, or revenues from exports. The infrastructure is then developed as long as the commercial project remains profitable. So basically, instead of just paying back with regular money, these countries promise to share some of the money they make from projects like selling oil, minerals, or profits from other ventures. Experts call this model the resource-backed lending model. This model is primarily used in poor countries that are rich in natural resources. China first applied the mixed funding model in a war-torn African country called Angola. During 2004 to 2010, Angola received around $10 billion from China's Exim Bank, with its oil as collateral. Later, China replicated this model in various countries, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2007, where the loans backed by mineral exports continue to finance infrastructure projects in the DRC. Guinea in 2017, too, entered into a bauxite-backed financing agreement with Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and the China Exim Bank for $587 million for its 2 road projects. In fact, projects up to $30 billion have been signed in several African countries under this model. Along with this, China is always willing to accept repayment in alternative forms like geopolitical favors or acquiring strategic assets of that country. For example, China converted a $230 million loan into grants for the construction of the Gwadar International Airport, which provided China the sole right to construct the airport instead of relying on competitive bidding processes. Compare that to the IMF and other financial institutions who stay out of these shady agreements and prefer to receive payments only in cash. These are the major reasons why borrowing from China looks like a win-win situation at a first glance. And if you're thinking that only Asian and African countries get attracted to these loans, then take a look at this map. If you notice, it includes 12 port projects on the European continent, including 2 ports in Spain, 3 in Ukraine, and 1 in Germany, Latvia, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Italy, and Greece. All these ports handle about 10% of Europe's shipping container capacity. Here, the Chinese stakes in the Zeebrugge port in Belgium and the Mykolaiv port in Ukraine have even reached 100%. Surprisingly, 3 of these countries, namely Ukraine, Latvia, and Greece, are even BRI signatories. In fact, Chinese loans to European countries almost quadrupled to 23% from 2018 to 2021. And it's not just that. Chinese loans have reached the South and North American continents as well, with investments in 10 port projects in countries like Chile, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, the Bahamas, Mexico, and 2 port terminals here in the US. In fact, some of these ports handle some of the highest traffic volumes for those countries. For example, in Brazil, the port of Paranaguá receives the 3rd highest amount of traffic, and shockingly, China has a 90% stake in this port. Similarly, 60% of the Chancay port in Peru is owned by China, which is clearly dangerous for these countries. Among all the ports we mentioned, one of the most infamous cases, apart from the Hambantota port, that not only made headlines worldwide a few years ago, but also demonstrates the influence China has on a continent, is located in Europe. This port is one of the most critical ports in Europe, and the world was shocked when China acquired a controlling stake in the largest port of Greece, the 7th largest port in Europe, the Piraeus port. The story begins in 2015, when Greece was grappling with a massive debt crisis. It also missed a €1.6 billion payment to the IMF, making it the first developed nation to have missed such a payment. This was a time when no one was interested in investing in Greece. And this is when China saw an opportunity. A Chinese company named COSCO, C-O-S-C-O, swept in and acquired a controlling stake in the Piraeus port. Well, this was not the first time COSCO was operating the Greek port. COSCO, boy, it's gonna throw me off to be calling it that, first secured the right to operate parts of Piraeus in 2008. Later, during Greece's economic crisis, it acquired 51% of the port in 2016, and again increased it to 67% in October of 2021. So, as of now, COSCO has the majority stake, which means the Chinese shipping company can decide the future of the port. Because of the location, this port serves as China's gateway into Europe and the Middle East. Surprisingly, after COSCO started handling the port in 2008, the container volume rose by almost 7 times in the next 10 years, to 5.65 million TEU, or 20-foot equivalent units, which is basically a standard unit of measure, often used in marine cargo transport. In fact, this port became one of the fastest-growing ports in the world. Additionally, COSCO claims that this port provided direct and indirect employment to over 10,000 people. So, everything seems fine, right? Thousands of people are getting employed and the port is doing very well, and that too with Chinese investment. Actually, we only saw one side of this story. According to Giorgos Gogos, leader of a workers' union at Piraeus, the working conditions have worsened after China's entry into Piraeus. Also, according to Giorgos, the workers at Piraeus receive no safety training, resulting in multiple accidents happening at the port. In October of 2021, the port's unions called a 24-hour strike after one worker died when he was struck by a container crane. On top of that, most of the workers were hired on contract basis, leaving them with no job security. And in addition to all of this, even employees at senior positions were replaced by Chinese employees. According to Marcos, a worker at the port, whenever the workforce tried to raise a voice against all these practices, they were fired by COSCO. So the workers were too scared to speak up. Sometimes these workers even worked the whole shift without taking any breaks. He also mentioned that, at times, his co-workers had to urinate in plastic bottles. Such was the pathetic conditions of the workers at the Piraeus port. On top of that, most of the equipment and materials used in COSCO-led construction at Piraeus Port were imported from China. So again, most of the funds just went back to China. From a geopolitical angle, the Chinese presence is a huge threat to the region. Bordering the Mediterranean Sea on the south and the Balkan Peninsula on the north, Piraeus is one of the closest Mediterranean ports on the European continent to the Suez Canal, Gibraltar main shipping routes. It also has railway connection to the hinterland of Central and Eastern Europe, and as you know, the Suez Canal is the same passage through which 12% of goods worth more than $1 trillion pass through this route. And it's not only about trade. About 20 million passengers go through Piraeus each year. Its strategic location makes it an important port in the Mediterranean. So, China has an excellent opportunity to get a foothold in Europe through this port. Considering China's stake, China can use this port as a deterrent pretty much any time. Although the chances seem very low because of global pressure, but still, the chances, it can't be ignored. And I'm not just guessing it out of thin air here. The Chinese Navy has played this card before. In July 2017, the Chinese naval fleet, including a missile destroyer, a missile frigate, and a supply vessel, paid a visit to the Piraeus port. But hold on. These were incidents from the past. It's 2024 now, and things have changed. And are changing drastically. The countries that were once trapped in China's debt have shown massive resistance to China. Countries are opting out of the BRI. Many of them have banned Chinese companies. They are showing strong resistance to Chinese bullying. It seems the world has learned to contain the dragon. And it's not just the big countries. Even the smaller countries are standing firmly against the dragon's might. The same Greece, which once sold a controlling stake to China out of a compulsion, later blocked a Chinese company named China's State Grid from bidding on power distribution projects. Now, this happened in January of 2021, when Greece allowed companies to bid for a 49% stake in the country's mid to low voltage distribution network operator. The Chinese company, China's State Grid, already held a 24% stake in Greece's high voltage independent power transmission operator, but it wanted more. Greece didn't want the Chinese ownership to reach dangerous levels, so it straightaway blocked the Chinese entity. And Greece didn't stop here. It also disqualified another Chinese state-owned enterprise, South Power Grid, from participating in the bid. In the case of the port, too, the decision to sell the stake to a Chinese firm has been backfiring. It has been facing a lot of opposition from the locals in the region, with the major reasons being poor work conditions and the involvement of a foreign company. COSCO's plans to build a new hotel, mall, and other facilities in the port area have been delayed, and COSCO has blamed this delay on Greece's complex administrative requirements and local opposition. On the other hand, according to Greece, the expansion has been delayed because Greece refused to accept the environmental studies provided by COSCO, calling them insufficient. And we all know how much China cares about the environment, especially when it comes to a foreign country. On top of that, the people living near the port are trying to stop COSCO's plans through legal action. So clearly China is facing huge opposition in the European country. In the same continent, another country made a decision that proved to be a huge setback for Chinese influences in Europe.
The Italians are moving away from Xi Jinping's pet project, the flagship Belt and Road Initiative. Italy has confirmed that it will pull out of China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's administration notified Beijing that it would cease participating in the BRI.
Yes, you heard it right. The only G7 country which once joined the BRI, Italy, is no longer a part of the BRI. On the 21st of April, 2023, Italian PM Meloni confirmed that Italy intended to exit the BRI. And finally, on December 6th, 2023, just 4 years after joining the BRI, the Italian government formally announced that Italy will not renew the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, regarding its formal participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. This wasn't the only blow to China in Europe. Just a year ago, in 2022, Estonia and Latvia quit the China 17+1 group, which was an initiative by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to promote business and investment relations between China and Europe. In 2021, it was Lithuania which not only left 17+1, but also urged other European countries to leave. In fact, Lithuania, a country with a population of less than 3 million, did a thing that even some of the most powerful countries on the planet would hesitate to do. It started strengthening its ties with Taiwan, to such an extent that China has even banned Lithuanian products from entering the Chinese market. In fact, Lithuania has even scheduled a visit of its 11 MPs to meet Taiwan's newly elected president this year. Now, if you think it's just Europe who's slaying the dragon, oh, you're wrong. The African continent, once a bastion for Chinese loans, is now slowly and steadily turning its back on China. The Chinese loans to African countries fell from 31% of the total in 2018 to just 12% in 2021. In fact, the Chinese loan commitments to Africa, which peaked to $28 billion in 2016, fell to just $11 billion in 2018, $1.9 billion as of 2020, and dropped to $995 million in 2022. The major reasons behind this are falling demand for Chinese debt, economic slowdown, and China's own economic problems. This is why, as you can see in the graph, the World Bank overtook Chinese lenders in 2017, with its loans shooting up from almost $7 billion in 2010 to more than $30 billion in 2022. When it comes to the ports, the $10 billion Bagamoyo port project in Tanzania, which was signed in 2013 between China and Tanzania, almost got canceled by Tanzania's then president, John Magufuli, in 2019, because he believed the project was meant to exploit Tanzania. Unfortunately, Tanzania's new president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, decided to revive this project. In the case of Asia, where China has invested billions of dollars with hope to reap huge benefits, China is either witnessing cancellation of projects or its own projects are backfiring. For instance, Pakistan's Gwadar port, where China has spent billions in hopes of decreasing their reliance on the Malacca Strait, the project could potentially fail. This is because even if the Pakistani government couldn't oppose the Chinese investment to a large extent, the locals in the region have literally started revolting against the Chinese. In fact, the whole region, known as Balochistan, is a highly unstable region. And this is not only about China and its projects. The rebel groups in this region are also against the Pakistani army, because Pakistan has never focused on the development of the Balochistan province, even though they keep extracting natural resources from the region. Considering these issues, China built a school, sent doctors, and promised some $500 million for the construction of a hospital, a college, and various infrastructure projects to supply the city with drinking water. Pakistan even deployed around 12,000 soldiers to protect the Chinese workers. But still, the attacks have not stopped on the Pakistani army or the workers involved on various infrastructure projects linked to CPEC. Another reason why this port could fail is because it passes through Kashmir, another highly unstable region. This region is claimed by India, who called Pakistan's presence an illegal occupation. According to military experts, India could potentially recapture this region very soon, cutting off China's access. If this happens, China's billions of dollars might go in vain. Moving our focus to Myanmar, China planned to build the Chaukpu port project at a cost of $7 billion. But later, Myanmar itself decreased this amount to $1.3 billion. China's investment in the project was reduced because Myanmar was aware of Chinese debt traps, and they didn't want to fall for it. Even so, Myanmar took $1.3 billion because its economy was already weak and it really had no other options. But this incident indicates that countries are becoming aware of these Chinese debt traps. And many other nations are canceling Chinese debt. Samoa, a small country in the South Pacific Ocean, also decided to cancel a $100 million Chinese-backed port development in 2021, calling it an excessive amount for the small Pacific island that is already in heavy debt to China. China is also present in Israel's Haifa port. Haifa is one of the main seaports in Israel, where about 99% of all goods move in and out of the country by sea. China's Shanghai International Port Group already operates a port at Haifa. So to counter it, Israel has awarded a major contract to an Indian company named Adani Ports in 2022. Adani Ports acquired a major part of the port for $1.13 billion for operations. Sri Lanka is tackling China with the help of other major economies. The US is investing more than $500 million in a port terminal in Colombo, which is being developed by Indian Adani Ports. The financing by the American government's International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, is being seen as America's move to counter China's influence in South Asia. In fact, this is the biggest investment so far in Asia by the DFC. And on top of that, Adani signed a $700 million build, operate, transfer deal in 2021 with the Sri Lankan Ports Authority to develop and run the strategic Colombo Port's Western Container Terminal. Similarly, India has assisted Sri Lanka with $3.8 billion, which includes currency swaps, grants, credit lines, humanitarian supplies, and infrastructure development. To reciprocate this help, Sri Lanka canceled Chinese projects in the Jaffna Peninsula. They allowed India to invest in the energy sector and built a free-floating dock facility, Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. Surprisingly, one of the subunits of this MRCC will also be installed in the China-operated Hambantota port. A similar story is happening in Bangladesh, where India and Japan have joined hands to counter China. India and Japan have decided to develop a port named Matabari Port in Bangladesh, which would be a deep-sea port that would help not only Bangladesh, but also India and Japan in connectivity. Looking forward, only time will tell what future steps other countries will take to counter China.